October 1962 became one of the most dangerous moments in human history. The Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States had already lasted more than a decade, and tensions between the two superpowers had reached a critical point. After the failed attempt to overthrow Cuban leader Fidel Castro during the Bay of Pigs invasion, Soviet leadership made a bold and risky decision to deploy nuclear missiles in Cuba. These medium-range ballistic missiles were capable of striking major American cities within minutes, dramatically changing the global balance of power. For Moscow, this was both a way to protect an ally and a response to American nuclear missiles stationed in Europe near Soviet borders. But for Washington, the discovery of Soviet nuclear weapons, just 90 miles from American shores, was nothing short of shocking. On October 14th, an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft captured photographs confirming the presence of missile launch sites on the island. The Cuban Missile Crisis had begun. President John F. Kennedy immediately convened an emergency meeting of his top advisors. After intense debate, the United States announced a naval blockade of Cuba, officially called a quarantine. The U.S. Navy was ordered to prevent Soviet ships from reaching the island. In response, the Soviet Union placed its armed forces on heightened alert. Both nations began preparing for a possible military confrontation that could escalate into full-scale nuclear war. While political leaders exchanged ultimatums and diplomatic messages, events were unfolding in the Atlantic Ocean that remained almost completely unknown to the world. The Soviet Navy had dispatched several diesel-powered submarines toward Cuba as part of a secret operation. One of them was Submarine B-59. Its mission was extremely dangerous and highly classified. On board was a weapon unlike anything the crew had ever carried before, a nuclear-armed torpedo with a yield of approximately 10 kilotons, comparable to the atomic bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. This meant that a single launch could trigger catastrophic consequences and potentially ignite a global conflict. Conditions aboard diesel submarines at the time were already harsh under normal circumstances, but during this mission they became nearly unbearable. The submarine remained submerged for extended periods to avoid detection by American forces. Batteries were running low, ventilation systems struggled to function, and the temperature inside the vessel climbed to nearly 50 degrees Celsius, about 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity was suffocating, carbon dioxide levels were rising, and the air became increasingly toxic. Sailors suffered from exhaustion, dehydration, and dizziness. Many were barely able to function. The psychological strain was just as severe. Communication with Moscow was unreliable and sometimes completely lost. The crew had no clear understanding of what was happening in the outside world. They didn't know whether war had already begun. The situation escalated dramatically when American naval forces detected the submarine. U.S. destroyers began dropping small depth charges, practice explosives, intended as warning signals to force the submarine to surface. The Americans had no intention of destroying the vessel. But the Soviet crew had no way of knowing that. Inside B-59, each explosion felt like a real attack. Shock waves slammed into the hull, metal structures groaned and vibrated, instruments rattled violently, and the crew believed they were under direct assault. The commander of B-59, Captain Valentin Savitsky, found himself under enormous psychological pressure. He knew the submarine had been detected. Communication with Moscow was lost, and explosions were occurring all around them. In the unbearable heat and stress, he reached a conclusion that seemed logical at the time. If the Americans were using weapons, then the war must have already started. According to later testimonies, Savitsky was convinced they were being attacked for real. He reportedly declared that the submarine would not go down without fighting back, and that they would strike the enemy before dying. It was at that moment that he ordered the crew to prepare their most powerful weapon, the nuclear torpedo. The nuclear torpedo aboard B-59 was a weapon of extraordinary destructive power. If launched against the American naval group surrounding them, the explosion would have destroyed multiple ships and caused massive casualties within seconds. But the immediate destruction was only part of the danger. Such an attack would almost certainly have triggered a U.S. military response. American leadership would likely interpret the strike as the beginning of full-scale war initiated by the Soviet Union. Given the extreme tensions of the Cuban Missile Crisis, this could have set off a chain reaction of decisions leading to a global nuclear exchange between the two superpowers. Millions of lives could have been lost within hours. However, Soviet protocol required multiple authorizations before nuclear weapons could be used. The launch of the torpedo required unanimous approval from 3 senior officers on board: the submarine commander, the political officer, and the flotilla's second-in-command, who happened to be present on the submarine. 2 of them had already agreed with Savitsky's decision. Only 1 officer remained. His name was Vasili Arkhipov. Arkhipov was an experienced naval officer and highly respected among the crew. He had previously served in dangerous missions and had demonstrated remarkable composure under pressure. Unlike the others, he was not convinced that war had actually begun. Despite the unbearable heat, exhaustion, and chaos, Arkhipov managed to remain calm and analytical. He suggested that the Americans might simply be trying to force the submarine to surface rather than destroy it. He insisted that launching a nuclear weapon without confirmation from Moscow would be reckless and potentially catastrophic. A heated argument broke out among the officers. The atmosphere inside the submarine was tense and emotional. The crew was on the edge of physical collapse. Explosions continued outside the hull, and time seemed to be running out. Captain Savitsky was prepared to authorize the launch, believing honor and duty required retaliation. Arkhipov, however, argued that reason must prevail. He urged the commander to surface and establish communication before making an irreversible decision. This confrontation became one of the most dramatic unseen moments of the Cold War, though at the time, the world knew nothing about it. In the end, Arkhipov's persistence made the difference. He refused to give his consent for the nuclear launch. Without his approval, the torpedo could not be fired. After intense discussion, Savitsky finally agreed to stand down. The submarine surfaced. Once on the surface, it became clear that full-scale war had not begun. The American ships had indeed used only warning depth charges, not lethal weapons. Humanity had come dangerously close to catastrophe, but disaster had been avoided. Historians would later describe the B-59 incident as one of the most dangerous moments of the entire Cold War. Many experts believe that Vasili Arkhipov's decision prevented a possible Third World War. His name remained largely unknown for decades because the mission was classified. Only years later did the world learn how close humanity had come to nuclear disaster. The story of B-59 serves as a powerful reminder of how fragile the line between war and peace can be. Sometimes the fate of millions does not depend on presidents or generals, but on one individual who finds the courage to remain rational in the most critical moment. Vasili Arkhipov did not press the nuclear trigger, and because of that, the world we live in today may still exist.